Republicans who helped advance the bill yesterday are expected to offer amendments seeking changes related to religious organizations. The Senate will break between 12:30 to 2:15 for their usual weekly party lunches. Live coverage of the Senate right now on C-SPAN 2.
Today's opening prayer will be offered by the Reverend Gregory Knox Jones of the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, Delaware. Reverend Jones.
Let us pray. Mighty God, Creator of all that is, we give thanks for this great nation, for its bounteous resources, its diversity of people, and for its principles of liberty and justice for all. Not only for the privileged, not only for the powerful, but for all, because each of us is one of your beloved children. Call forth the best in these servants, that they may bring honor to themselves and instill confidence in those who have entrusted them with breathtaking responsibility. Banish from this historic hall small-mindedness and mean-spiritedness that parade as purity. Instead, bless these men and women with that rare and priceless virtue of humility. Holy wisdom, bolster their courage, that they may always refrain from hollow rhetoric and selfish gain, and instead strive for decisions that bring great promise to all people. Enable them to glimpse your vision of a world where those who are ill are cared for by the compassionate, and the hungry are filled because the well-off are generous. Embolden each member in this chamber with a burning desire to do the hard work of governing, that each may become a true servant of yours and of this nation, so that they may become a model of inspiration to our children and grandchildren and lead us all to a future of promise. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I'm wondering if obviously not. Following my remarks and those of Senator McConnell, Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-815, which is the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, post-cloture. Senate will recess from 12:30 to 2:15 p.m. to offer the weekly caucus meetings. I hope we can reach an agreement to move forward on the bill today. Mr. President, I'm wondering if my friend from Delaware wishes to make a speech regarding the guest chaplain. If so, I'd be happy to yield to him.
The chair recognizes the senator from Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. President. My thanks as well to our Majority Leader this morning. Before I say a few words about Reverend Gregory Knox Jones, I just want to go back in time just for a couple of minutes. And I was talking to the pages out in the hall behind your leader about how when our country was first settled, folks came here from all over the world. They came here in part in pursuit of religious freedom. They are people of different faiths. They wanted to be able to worship God as they saw fit. And one of the tough things that really are tough in the Philadelphia and the Constitutional Convention are trying to wrestle with issues like slavery, rights of women, whether there should be little states, big states, how we're going to be represented here. Many times the Founding Fathers hit the pause button, and they called in a person of faith to pray to help them find a way to yes. And they did again and again and again. When George Washington was inaugurated, not here but in New York City, they at the end of the day, they didn't go off and have big parties. They actually went to church. And in the early days of our country, worship services were actually held here, as some of us know. We start every day here in the United States Senate with a prayer, oftentimes delivered by our pastor, retired Navy Admiral Barry Black, our chaplain, and today with a special guest, my pastor, Gregory Knox Jones from Westminster Presbyterian Church. He just, our leader, Harry Reid, Mr. President, has run a number of marathons. As it turns out, so has our guest lecturer. He's a long-distance runner, both literally and figuratively. He just ran his 10th marathon. He ran the New York Marathon on Sunday, had a good time. And I like to say, Mr. Leader, he won the category white men over 50 who pastor large Presbyterian churches on the East Coast and were former defensive team captains for Kansas State University football team. That category, he won, hands down. And I want to congratulate him, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well. He reminds us every Sunday of the idea that we have a moral imperative to look out for the least of these in our society. People that are hungry, who need to be fed, people who have no place to live, people who have no health care, we have an obligation to look after them. He reminds us every Sunday that we have not just an obligation to those who live in our community, in Wilmington or in Delaware, but way beyond our borders in places like Guatemala. We also care about those that live in Israel and the West Bank of Jordan, to make sure that some justice is done in those places as well. He reminds us every Sunday of the golden rule: who is my neighbor? The need to treat others as we want to be treated. And we have a focus, we have to focus on the poor, the widows, and the orphans, and those who are in need. He reminds us to not just talk a good game, but to actually deliver on our words. You may, what is it in James 2? Show me your faith by your words. I will show you my faith by my deeds. He reminds us of that every Sunday. And he reminds us, to my colleagues, he reminds us that we are servants. Great sermon a couple of months ago from Mark chapter 10, where the words, as I recall, I'll paraphrase them: for those who want to be a leader, you've got to be a slave to all. For those who want to be first, you must become last. And we thank you for those remembrances. And actually, I come every week. I go to a Bible study that's led by our chaplain, and Sundays I try to show up at our own church. And it reminds me, Mr. President, of like a double shot. And you and I are the same age. President, are about the same age, and we remember the days of Motown. A great song called "Double Shot of My Baby's Love." Well, every week I get a double shot of God's love from these two men, my pastor and our chaplain. I'll close with this: just a warm welcome to his family, Camilla, his life partner, their 3 children, and their 6 grandchildren. We're honored that you're here. And I just want to close with the way he closes our sermons every Sunday, colleagues, and he does with these words. I hope I've got them right, Pastor, but it goes something like this: that when he lets us go and dismisses his flock, he says these words: "May the love of God, the grace of Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit bless you, those you love, and the ones that no one loves, and the ones that no one loves." And he sends us on our way. Those are great words for us today as well. And we welcome him, and thank you, Mr. Leader, for giving me a chance to say these words this morning. Thank you.
Mr. President, I'm told that H.R. 3204 is due for second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
H.R. 3204, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes.
I would object to any further proceedings at this time regarding this legislation.
Objection having been heard, bill will be placed on the calendar.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed upon the calendar.
Mr. President, I have spoken to the Republican leader on more than one occasion, but I want to make sure all the members understand that we have this is a 4-week work period. We're in the second week of that 4-week work period, and we have certain things that we've outlined that need to get accomplished. And so I would hope that everyone understands things that we have to get done this week, next week, and the week after. Now, the reason that we're pressing so much work into this limited work schedule is, first of all, it's necessary for a number of reasons. And secondly, the Senate has worked over the last number of years really hard during holidays. Our families, I've traveled trying to get home for Christmas. I leave here on Christmas Eve. I've done that twice. And it's been extremely difficult for Christmas, Thanksgiving, and of course New Year's. It's wonderful to be able to go home with our families, our friends, but also, Mr. President, we have work to do. We represent our states. And there are things we can't do when we can only go home for weekends. And some of us who live a long ways away, it's a day to get there, a day to get back. And so it really is more complicated for those that live west of Mississippi. So the whole point of this, Mr. President, is to indicate to everyone we're going to try to take Thanksgiving week off and the week after. The Republican leader and I, we really want to get that done. But we can't do it if we're held up on procedural matters that are unnecessary. So I've outlined what we need to get done. I've explained this to the Republican leader. I've explained it to my caucus on more than one occasion. And the issue at hand, Mr. President, is this. We have a few weekends left. We're going to be out Monday because it's Veterans Day. But all weekends until we leave here for Thanksgiving are going to be work weekends in order to get our work done. So I know people have schedules, but understand you better keep them pretty loose. Otherwise, you're going to be missing some votes around here. ENDA we voted on last night, and we were able to move that, get past the cloture aspect of that. We have a way of going forward on this. There's no reason to eat up the whole 30 hours that are post-cloture. I'm just telling everybody who's, in effect, forcing us to do this, that it may impinge upon the holidays, first the situation dealing with Thanksgiving. I would hope we could get out of here on the Friday before Thanksgiving. But it's up to people who've gotten into the habit of having unnecessary delays. So I need not say more. I really would like, for me personally, and for the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to have those 2 weekends off. So take a look at where we are post-cloture on a motion to proceed to ENDA, Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Mr. President, I was disappointed to read yesterday that Speaker Boehner opposes the Employment Non-Discrimination Act because he believes it will result in frivolous lawsuits. But coming from the man whose caucus spent $3 million in taxpayer dollars defending the unconstitutional defense of marriage law in court, that's pretty rich. Still, I thought it was important to investigate the Speaker's claim that protecting lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans from being denied job opportunities, fired, harassed because of their sexual orientation or gender identity would risk American jobs. Mr. President, to the contrary, according to a study by the United States Government Accountability Office, nonpartisan, in 21 states that have some protection against this kind of discrimination, relatively few lawsuits have resulted. Almost every state with anti-discrimination law that protects workplace discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender individuals had fewer than 10 lawsuits filed between 2007 and 2012, according to the study. In fact, the lack of one clear, consistent federal standard protecting against this harassment actually creates more confusion for business and local government. So I was also stunned when the Speaker said today he wasn't going to bring it up for a vote. Yesterday he said he just didn't like it. Today he said he's not going to bring it up for a vote. If it came up for a vote in the House, it would pass. We can look at a number of different examples of this litigation aspect that he raised. Take the example of Kyle Nave, a veteran police officer who was fired from the Audubon Park Police Department, Louisville, Kentucky, after 3 years of being terrorized by his supervisors. After speaking up against the harassment, he was fired. Kentucky is one of 33 states with no statute preventing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But Louisville has a local non-discrimination ordinance, and the department had a written policy against sexual harassment, although it did not expressly protect against discrimination based on sexual orientation. So, Officer Nave has filed 2 separate legal complaints against his former employer. Those complaints are still pending. If there was one federal law protecting all Americans from discrimination instead of a patchwork of ineffective and inefficient state and local laws, it would be simpler and less confusing for business and employees alike. That's one reason more than 100 of the nation's largest companies support the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and why most Fortune 500 companies already prohibit persecution based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Those companies know that to recruit the best and brightest employees and remain competitive, they must foster an environment where all workers can reach their full potential. Not only is Speaker Boehner's claim that ENDA would hurt business untrue, it's also callous. It fails to take into account the heartbreak and suffering, not to mention lost wages and productivity, that workplace discrimination causes every year. When Kyle Nave was hired by the Audubon Police Department, he had already served 20 years, 2 decades, as a police officer with other departments. This is what he said yesterday, and I quote, "I've been a law enforcement officer since 1989 and have never experienced anything like what I experienced with my previous employer. But I wasn't going to let them push me out of the job that I loved," close quote. So for 3.5 years, Kyle endured torture at the hands of two of his supervisors, including the chief and the deputy chief. Although co-workers described Officer Nave's on-the-job performance as exemplary, his supervisors called him derogatory names, told gay jokes in front of him and about him, and directed profanity-laced rants toward him. Mr. President, this is the chief and the assistant chief. This is what Officer Nave remembers about trying to get through the ordeal. Quote, "Each day I kept thinking, it's going to get better today." But it didn't. As a police officer, you're supposed to have thick skin, but it never got any better, close quote. Then last year, 2 weeks after Officer Nave filed a formal complaint with his chief, he was fired based on the charges of insubordination, somebody who had been basically a police officer for a quarter of a century. For the first time since he was 16 years old, Kyle Nave was unemployed, as he is right now. He's still unemployed. And although Kyle would love to return to police work and doing the job he loves and did it for a long, long time, no department will hire him with the termination on his resume. With one simple federal law in place, such as the ENDA bill, people like Kyle could go to work without fearing such torment, and it was torment. Every American deserves that right and that protection, and every employee deserves to be judged on the quality of his or her work instead of on their sexual orientation or gender identity.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Almost a year ago now, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder signed historic right-to-work legislation into law. At the time, he said he viewed it as an opportunity to stand up for Michigan's workers, to be pro-worker. The union bosses, the entrenched special interests, and the professional left have stood in united militant disagreement. But Michigan's soft-spoken governor was right. And the more venom big labor directed at him, the more it seemed to confirm the suspicions of many of the middle-class workers that Snyder was trying to help. He was, in fact, on their side. The truth is, over the years, big labor has come to care more about its own perks and power than the workers it was charged with protecting. Snyder knew that, and he knew it was time to tip the scales back in favor of workers. Well, he's not alone. Here in the Senate, Senator Paul and I share Governor Snyder's commitment to helping restore worker rights. And that's why yesterday we filed an amendment that would enact similar forward-looking reforms at the federal level. Our right-to-work amendment is simple enough. It merely calls for repealing the discriminatory clauses in federal law that allow, as a condition of employment, forcing workers to join a union or forcing workers to pay union dues. In practical terms, here's what that would mean for middle-class folks in Kentucky and across America. If you want to join a union, you can. If you don't want to join a union, you don't have to. That's it. That's all this is about. This is just common sense. It's basic fairness. According to one survey, about 80% of unionized workers agree that employees should be able to decide whether or not joining a union is for them. But this amendment isn't just about ending institutional discrimination against workers. It's also about job creation, economic growth, and making America more competitive in the 21st century. Consider the fact that manufacturing employment is one-third higher in states with right-to-work laws, or that according to a recent study, states with right to work saw improvements in real personal income and average annual employment compared to what they would have seen without such laws, or that many of our nation's labor laws were passed in an earlier era, in some cases before many folks even had television sets. America's labor regulations are antiquated, and they need to be updated for the modern world. That's what the flex time legislation I introduced last week sought to achieve, and that's what Right to Work seeks to achieve as well. Protecting the rights of workers, creating jobs, growing the economy, and keeping pace with the modern world. That's what Right to Work is all about. It's just common sense. And if states like Michigan, with proud traditions of organized labor, can look their problems in the face and act, then it's time for the federal government to act too. So I would urge my colleagues to join Senator Paul and me in supporting this important amendment. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to say a word about Obamacare as well. I want to remind my colleagues that the President is absolutely correct. He's correct when he says that Obamacare is about so much more than some flawed website. It's about people. People like the California woman with stage 4 gallbladder cancer whose story we read about in the Wall Street Journal just this past weekend. I'd like to read some of what she wrote. I'm a determined fighter and extremely lucky, but this luck may have just run out. My affordable, life-saving medical insurance policy has been canceled effective December 31st. Here are the impossible choices she says she's left with. She can either get coverage through the exchange and lose access to her cancer doctors, or she can pay up to 50% more, as she put it, the privilege of starting over with an unfamiliar insurance company and impaired benefits. Now, Mr. President, that's just not right. It's not what the President promised, and it's not the kind of health reform Americans asked for. So we should keep our focus where it belongs, on the real people getting hurt by this law. But that doesn't mean we should stop asking questions about healthcare.gov, too. Because if the government can't even run a website that it had 3 years, and hundreds of millions of dollars to create, can Americans really entrust the same bureaucracy with even more power over their health care? The calamitous rollout reminds us that we do not even know if data being submitted over this website is 100% secure. And in today's age of digital scammers, there's a real concern for my constituents. Identity theft is about the last thing Americans need to be dealing with right now, especially with everything else this economy and this law have been throwing right at them. They're really mad enough about the President's repeated, unequivocal claims of, if you like it, you can keep it. The White House keeps trying to message its way out of this whopper. But no matter what they say, the reality remains. People are getting hurt. People are getting hit with premiums they can't afford, and millions are losing the coverage that they like. In my home state of Kentucky alone, 130,000 individual policies and 150,000 small group policies will be canceled. And remember, the President assured Americans up and down that this wasn't going to happen. I read about one D.C. woman who just lost her plan. She found something comparable on the exchange, but it cost a lot more than what she had before. And here's what she said. It's just not fair. It's ridiculous. Well, she's not alone. So I'll say again, it's time for Washington Democrats to work with Republicans to start working for their constituents instead of thinking that their first priority is to protect the president and his namesake legislation.
Previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to Senate 815, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 184, S-815, a bill to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity.
Mr. President.
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak in morning business for 5 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I'm going to speak in morning business before addressing the matter that is pending before the United States Senate. I'll speak in morning business to respond to the Republican leader who just left the floor on 2 issues, as he spoke on 2 issues. First, the issue of unions in America. History shows us that after World War II, when labor organizations across the United States were at their peak, organizing workers, giving them an opportunity to bargain collectively in the workplace for wages and benefits and safety and retirement and health care. That was one of the most amazing periods in American history. The growth of the American middle class was unprecedented. As men and women, some fresh from serving in the war, came home and had a chance to earn a livelihood, to build a family, to build neighborhoods, communities, and literally build the middle class in America. It is no coincidence that when the workers were given this voice and this strength through the collective bargaining process, they prospered and America prospered. Today we are in a much more difficult and challenging situation when so many workers are living paycheck to paycheck, while their productivity gains when it comes to our economy are well documented, while the companies that they work for are showing unprecedented levels of profit, when the individuals who are managing these companies are being compensated at the highest levels in our history, many of these men and women working every day are falling further and further behind. If you look to the state of unionism today, I think the facts speak for themselves. Those in the private sector who are in organized labor, part of a labor union, are at a very low percentage. I think there's a parallel that can be drawn here. At a time when workers had a voice in the process, when their rights and their futures were within their control at a bargaining table, they prospered and America prospered. Today, without that strength at the bargaining table, many of these same families are falling further and further behind despite the profitability of the companies that they work for. So those who want to eliminate the opportunity for collective bargaining or make it more difficult for workers to stand up and speak for themselves in the workplace, I think, frankly, are going to condemn us to a much slower growing economy and much more injustice when it comes to compensation. Secondly, the Republican leader spoke to the whole issue of the Affordable Care Act, which is characterized by some as Obamacare. It is ironic that of the top 3 states, the most successful in signing up people for this new approach to health insurance, one is the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Some 31,000 people have signed up already through the Affordable Care Act. Governor Beshear was on television just about 10 days ago talking about the opportunities for Kentuckians to finally have an opportunity for affordable health insurance, some of them for the first time in their lives. It is an opportunity which I voted for and I support. I'll make no excuses for this dismal rollout of this website, and I hope that it's fixed soon so that people across the country will have ready access to the information they need about their health insurance. But I will not apologize for standing up for 40 or 50 million Americans who have no health insurance today. Those of us who have gone through life experiences as a father with a sick child and no health insurance will never forget it as long as you live. To sit in a waiting room of a hospital in Washington, D.C. with your baby and wonder who's going to walk through the door and take care of her because you don't have insurance. You just have to hope that the charity care being offered in that hospital will be good care. That is a feeling no one should ever have. I've lived it. I don't want others to have to live it. We've got to give to every American family a chance for health insurance. And let me say a word about this notion of canceled policies. The market of insurance that we're talking about here are people that are buying individual health insurance, not the group plans at most places of employment. It's a small segment, but an important segment of our population. If you look to the facts, you'll find that almost two-thirds of the people who were in the individual health insurance market, buying their own plans for their family, through a broker, for example, almost two-thirds of those plans are literally changed and canceled every 2 years. There is a lot of flux and change in this market, and prices continue to go up. At the end of the day, here's what we're facing. Some 2, 3, or 4 million people may find themselves in a more difficult position because the policy they once had doesn't meet the standards which have now been established in law for minimum health insurance coverage in America. What are those standards that we say should be in every health insurance policy? Number one, you cannot discriminate against people because of a pre-existing condition. Is there a person alive in America today, any family, that doesn't have someone with a pre-existing condition? It can be something as basic as asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, mental illness. These things literally disqualified people from coverage in health insurance. We've changed that law and said you cannot discriminate based on pre-existing conditions. That, I think, is basic. And secondly, we've said you can't put a lifetime limit on how much the insurance policy will pay. Who knows? Who knows whether they're one diagnosis or one accident away from needing health insurance that costs way beyond what we can even imagine? $100,000, $200,000, not an unusual charge for what used to be considered somewhat routine. We say you cannot cap the coverage in a health insurance policy because life is unpredictable and our medical future is unpredictable. That's one of the provisions that has to be built into the policy. We also say you can't discriminate against people in selling health insurance because they happen to be women. And there was rank discrimination against women in America when it came to the issuance of health insurance before this new law. We go on to say that 80% of the premiums you collect have to be paid into medical services, not taken out in profit and marketing. We also say that if you have a health insurance policy, your son or daughter can stay under it until they reach the age of 26. That's important to every family with a graduating college student or someone looking for a job in the household. They may not find a job, or if they do, it may not have benefits. Don't you want the peace of mind as a parent to know that up to age 26 you can keep them on the family policy? Now, I've just given you 5 things that are part of so-called Obamacare, 5 things that have to be written now into every health insurance policy, and 5 reasons why many companies are saying we have to cancel the old policy and reissue a new one consistent with these 5 principles, with these 5 protections. And that's why many of these policies are being rewritten. The President should have been more expansive in his explanation, but the fact is that is the story. That is what Affordable Care Act does. I hear the senator from Kentucky tell us that 120,000 people may face a new policy. Well, I'd like to ask, what is the normal turnover in health insurance policies in his state or other states? It happens with some frequency. 17 million Americans, it's estimated, 17 million Americans are going to have help in paying for their health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act. That means some will qualify for Medicaid. That means others will receive tax credits and tax benefits to help with their health insurance payments. We're moving toward a society that has health insurance protection for all, and that is a good thing, not just for the peace of mind of each and every individual and family affected by it, but also because the system becomes more just, more fair. Uninsured people get sick. They go to the hospital. They go to the doctor. They incur bills, many of which they can't pay, and that burden is shifted to everyone else in America. Let's accept the personal responsibility of health insurance. Let's move forward as the state of Massachusetts. The presiding officer has already done. Some 98%, I understand, have health insurance protection in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, thanks to the leadership of Governor Mitt Romney and the cooperation of both political parties. Massachusetts has shown us the way. Let's follow that now. Let's not turn our back on it. And the last point I'll make on this issue is I keep hearing from the Republican side they have a better idea. What is it? I'd like to see the proposal from the Republican side that they would put up against the Affordable Care Act. You'll never see it because they basically believe let the market work its will. The market working its will has resulted in 40 to 50 million uninsured Americans. The number is growing, and it shouldn't. It won't under the Affordable Care Act. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to address the item of business pending before the United States Senate, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and ask consent that it be shown at a separate part of the record from my earlier statement.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, it was about 20 years ago that I first heard the name Marguerite Kammermeier. I had no idea who she was, but I read about her, and it turned out she was a remarkable woman. She started off during the Vietnam era as a combat nurse in the Air Force. She risked her life in Vietnam to save the lives of those who were in battle and those who were injured and wounded. And then after the war, she rose through the ranks and became a colonel in the United States Air Force. There came a time when she had to make a disclosure, a regular disclosure, and in that disclosure, she said for the first time publicly that she was gay. Marguerite Kammermeier, a colonel in the Air Force, conceded that she was gay. As a result of that concession and statement, she was discharged from the Air Force. Had she done anything wrong? Not a single thing. She'd done everything right, including risking her life as a combat nurse in the Air Force and moving up through the ranks with a stellar record. But her admission that she was gay in those days, 20 years ago, was grounds for her discharge from the U.S. Air Force. I never met her, but I heard her story and thought, that is just plain wrong. She served our country and served it well, and to discharge her from the military because of this admission is just unfair. The first time I ever saw her, Mr. President, was a few years ago. President Barack Obama was signing into law the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I was in the audience when that signing ceremony took place, and they called the name Marguerite Kammermeier to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's the first time I'd ever seen her. I remember that day also because there was a rabbi who gave an invocation. And he said in this invocation that if you look into the eye of another and you don't see the face of God, at least see the face of another human being. How apropos that Marguerite Kammermeier would give the Pledge of Allegiance and the rabbi that invocation, because it really calls into sharp focus what is pending on the floor of the United States Senate. You know, we waste too many hours and too many days and too many weeks on Capitol Hill with government shutdowns and threats of defaulting on our debt. But every once in a while, this Senate and this Congress can rise to the challenge and do something of an historic nature. Yesterday was one of those days, because yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate, by a margin of 62 votes, we voted to move forward on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And here's what it says, that you cannot discriminate against a person because of their sexual orientation or sexual identity. What I thought was unfair about Marguerite Kammermeier, dismissing her not for anything she'd done, but who she was, can happen now in more than half of the states. In more than half of the states, there is no protection against discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation or sexual identity. It means that in those states, you can literally be fired, denied a promotion, denied a raise, simply because of your sexual orientation. That isn't right. Luckily, we had bipartisan support last night. 7 Republicans joined us in voting to move forward on this bill. I came to the floor yesterday to thank one of them who spoke, Senator Collins of Maine. And her statement in the congressional record is an important one for everyone to read. But I'd like to call attention as well to my colleague, Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois, a Republican, who came to the floor of the United States Senate yesterday and gave his first speech on the floor in 2 years. You see, my colleague suffered a stroke, and as a consequence, he's gone through a lengthy rehab and hospitalization, and he's really made a remarkable comeback. I was here on the day when he walked up the steps in the United States Senate to the Capitol, and there were people of both political parties, senators cheering him on, as they should. And I've watched his progress ever since, and it is remarkable. His determination to serve our state and nation continues. And yesterday he gave his first speech on the floor in 2 years, and that speech was brief, but it was important. And I'd like to quote from my colleague's speech. He said, this is from Senator Kirk's statement yesterday in the Congressional Record, "I think it is particularly appropriate for an Illinois Republican to speak on behalf of this measure." I'm speaking of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. "In the true tradition of Everett McKinley Dirksen and Abraham Lincoln, men who gave us the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution." Mr. President, it was a brief statement, but it was important. Senator Kirk joined in a bipartisan effort to move this bill forward. I searched the congressional record. Of yesterday to look for one statement in opposition to the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. There's not one. And there was a specific opportunity given for anyone opposed to that measure to stand and speak. Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa supported it. He spoke eloquently from this desk yesterday before the vote, and then 2 minutes were allocated to those in opposition. No one stood to speak. But then 30 voted against it. So what I'd like to do is encourage my colleagues to take, in the spirit of Senator Kirk and Senator Collins, this opportunity for us to truly do something in a bipartisan way. Let us move this Employment Non-Discrimination Act forward, and let's do it with dispatch. We know that it's the right thing to do. America is not a stronger nation when there is discrimination anywhere, including the workplace. And this bill will end that form of discrimination. Now, there are those who say, well, you're just wasting your time, Senator, because Speaker John Boehner of Ohio has already announced that he not only opposes this, he will not let it see the light of day in the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. President, you served there for many years. I did as well. The Speaker has a lot of control in the House. He can decide what's going to come to the floor and what will not come to the floor, and unless a majority of the members of the House overrule him with a discharge petition, he usually has his way. But if we can show a strong bipartisan vote, even beyond the vote yesterday when 7 Republicans joined the Democrats in trying to end this form of discrimination, then perhaps we can prevail in the House of Representatives to move forward in what Senator Harkin characterized an historic achievement, putting an end to discrimination. We'll be a better nation for it. And both political parties should gather together all the political strength and support that they have to make this a reality. Mr. President, I ask that my complete statement be made part of the record, and I yield the floor.
Without objection, so ordered. The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
I see my colleague from Maryland here, and I promise I won't take all that time. Mr. President, during the debate over Obamacare back in 2009 and 2010, the President repeatedly and unequivocally promised his fellow Americans that if they liked their current health care plan, they could keep it. By one account, there were as many as 29 different times where the President was captured on videotape making that same unequivocal commitment. This is not an off-the-cuff remark or a casual throwaway comment. It was essential to the President's entire argument selling Obamacare. I heard the distinguished Majority Whip
from Illinois talking about the reasons why Obamacare was so important, suggesting that you couldn't cover pre-existing conditions or even young adults up to the age of 26 unless you accepted the whole package, the whole enchilada, as we'd say it in Texas. Well, that's just not true. The truth is, we're committed to dealing with pre-existing conditions. We're committed to helping people be able to buy and afford health care coverage. And what the President sold in 2009 and 2010 was basically sold under false pretenses, as it turns out. If Americans had known that Obamacare would result in them losing their current coverage, which they like, it never would have become law. According to one estimate, as many as 3.5 million people will lose their current health insurance coverage. Now, I've heard the revisionist history here on the floor and elsewhere. They're trying to change the commitment. Rather than you can keep your current coverage if you like it, period, which is, I know, what the President said at the American Medical Association and many other times, now they're trying to tweak that and saying if it isn't otherwise changed or canceled by your insurance company. Well, that isn't what the President said then. That isn't what the American people heard, and that isn't the basis upon which Obamacare was sold to the American people in 2009 and 2010. When President Obama campaigned for re-election in 2012, he reiterated his promise from 2009 and 2010. Again, a remarkably consistent message from the President. He said if you liked your existing plan and you wanted to keep it, you had nothing to worry about. Here's the exact statement that the President made on June the 28th, 2012 at a White House press conference. Quote, if you're one of the more than 250 million Americans who already have health insurance, you will keep your health insurance. Close quote. That's a direct quote. No qualifiers, no caveats, a simple, unequivocal promise. However, way back in 2010, we now learned that the Obama administration itself issued the very regulations which have made keeping this promise impossible. Indeed, the 2010 Obamacare regulations acknowledged that between 40 to 67% of all policies in the individual market would lose their grandfathered status by 2014 and must be required to meet the costly mandates in Obamacare. In other words, at the same time the President was making the promise, his own administration acknowledged that the regulations they were passing would make it impossible to keep it. Well, as you can imagine, people are increasingly frustrated by these broken promises. I recently set up a website in my office where my constituents can let me know how their personal health care coverage has been affected by the implementation of Obamacare. And I hope others who perhaps may hear my comments on the floor this morning, if they have stories that they would like for us to be able to tell to explain how these broken promises have resulted in their inability to keep what they have, I hope they will let us know on our website. It's cornyn.senate.gov. Well, I plan to forward these stories to the President. One woman from Livingston, Texas, over in East Texas, writes, quote, my health insurance is being canceled due to the Affordable Care Act. My insurance company offered a plan that I can keep until 2014. Guess what? It's 19% more a month than my current plan, and it drops coverage for laboratory and imaging studies. So not only is it more expensive, it actually reduces coverage. Going on, she said in December 2014, I'll have to change it again. Premiums for myself and my husband at that time will increase 100% each, which will equal just about half, 50% of our gross monthly income. What exactly are we supposed to do? Another woman from Pampa, Texas, up in the Texas Panhandle, writes that her monthly health insurance premiums have increased by 30% already over last year, and now her policy is being canceled altogether because of Obamacare. So she's got to purchase a new health insurance policy that will cost, in her words, quote, much more than her existing coverage. As her letter indicates, many of the folks losing their insurance will be forced to buy a new Obamacare-approved policy from an online exchange which doesn't even work yet. Well, it's no wonder that a growing number of our friends across the aisle are beginning to wonder, why didn't the administration extend the open enrollment period beyond March to 2014? They realize that they're marching in lockstep with the President when he made these promises, and the fact that these promises are not being kept is a political liability for them. At the very least, it's a hardship for their constituents that they'd like to see rectified. But why is the Obamacare website malfunctioning? It's an important question, but it's, again, just the tip of the iceberg. Remember, Obamacare became the law of the land more than 3.5 years ago. I think most people are astonished to learn that. Some news reports that I've read said that people thought Obamacare has already been fully implemented. We've been talking about it for so long, but it by design was created to be implemented over a many-year period of time. And I think that was a terrible mistake, because the political accountability that comes with implementing a law and then having to live with the political consequences of not delivering on your promises has now been delayed. But 3.5 years ago, the administration should have gotten prepared to roll out its signature legislative achievement. According to CBS News, one of President Obama's top outside health care advisors sent the White House a memo back in May of 2010 warning them that Obamacare was spiraling out of control. This memo came from Harvard economist David Cutler and reads in part, "I do not believe the relevant members of the administration understand the President's vision or have the capability to carry it out. You need to have people who have the understanding of the political process, people who understand how to work within the administration, and people who understand how to start and to build a business." And unfortunately, they just didn't get all of those people together. Republicans have for years been warning that this government takeover of 1/6 of our economy, this central planning scheme, social engineering, if you will, that it wouldn't work. At the very least, the federal government has proven itself incompetent on making something this big and this complicated and this expensive work as advertised. It's becoming increasingly clear. We spent years warning that Obamacare would force many Americans to lose their existing coverage. We spent years warning that Obamacare would limit patient choices and reduce health care options. And we've spent years warning that the law itself would prove to be unworkable. Now it appears that many of those warnings have come true. We are reiterating our call to dismantle Obamacare and to replace it with patient-centered reforms that will help bring down the cost, will not limit patient choices, and which will address most of the biggest problems in our broken health care system. There are other areas like pre-existing conditions, young adult coverage, that we could readily agree on. Those are not debatable, and I think the fact that the distinguished majority whip is suggesting you got to have Obamacare in order to get those is a gross exaggeration. Remember, Obamacare was sold as a policy that would expand health care coverage without raising costs and without disrupting anyone's existing health care arrangement. It's proven to be a false promise on both of those counts. Despite the promises made in 2009 and 2010, promises that were repeated on the campaign trail in 2012, it's becoming increasingly evident that Obamacare is making it harder for Americans to get or to keep the insurance coverage they already have and which they want. And by the way, Obamacare was sold to the American people as a way to getting everybody covered with insurance. Congressional Budget Office has documented that as many as 30 million people, 30 million Americans will remain uncovered even after Obamacare is fully implemented. So you haven't met the goal of complete universal coverage, the CBO says. You're finding that rather than your costs going down, they're going up, and you're finding that if you liked what you had, you can't keep it. Well, as Republicans have said all along, there are much better ways to expand health insurance coverage. I heard the majority whip this morning say that, they'd like to hear our plan. Well, either their memory is faulty or they just weren't listening. Obamacare regulations are incompatible with a genuine marketplace in health care insurance, and they're incompatible with cost control. I think perhaps the best example I can think of is where the market actually works in conjunction with a government program like Medicare prescription drug coverage. You remember when the Medicare prescription drug coverage plan was adopted, Medicare Part D, true competition in the market was created, and vendors competed for the business of beneficiaries when it came to selling them their prescription drug plan. And lo and behold, due to the discipline and the competition, not only was quality of service and costs go up and costs go down, we've seen that actually there's a 40% reduction, or I should say the cost of the plan is 40% under what was originally projected. That's something we could use with Obamacare, which has been completely rejected. But that's why we believe that we can replace Obamacare with reforms that will make it easier for people to acquire or keep a health insurance plan that meets their actual individual needs. My friends across the aisle continue to say we haven't offered a practical alternative, but that's just not true. Just to remind them, some of the alternatives that we've offered include equalizing the tax treatment of health care so that individuals purchasing insurance on their own are on the same level playing field as those who have employer-provided coverage. We would let Americans buy their health insurance coverage across state lines, something that's now not currently permitted, which would increase competition and increase consumer choice. So if I found a policy that I needed from Maryland or Massachusetts or anywhere else around the country, I could buy it. So could my 26 million constituents. We would let individuals in the small businesses form risk pools in the individual market, which is the most expensive part of the insurance market, helping to bring costs down. We would make price and quality information more transparent, again, to increase that discipline known as market forces, which would help improve consumer choice and, in the process, bring down cost while improving quality of service. And we would also expand the power of individuals to control their own health care spending through tax-free health savings accounts, which also have the additional benefit of providing skin in the game for consumers. One of the reasons why our health care spending is so high and so worrisome is that for too long our health care coverage was like a credit card that each of us, or many of us, not all of us, 85% of us had in our pocket, where we could continue to charge and charge and charge, but we'd never see the bill. Well, that's a recipe for a runaway system, which is the reason we do need true health insurance reform. Part of that reform would be to control frivolous malpractice lawsuits that help drive up costs by increasing the incentives for defensive medicine. Doctors treating patients not because they think it's called for based on clinical guidelines, but rather in their effort to say, I've conducted every test, I've done everything possible, so I can't get sued successfully. We would use high-risk pools to ensure that people with pre-existing conditions could get coverage, and we'd give the states a lot more flexibility in how to manage Medicaid. I read with interest that a lot of the increased coverage since Obamacare passed is not in the exchanges, but it's Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion. Well, in my state, Medicaid pays a doctor about 50 cents on the dollar for what private is that doctor, and so only about a third of doctors will actually see a new Medicaid patient because the cost of doing so eats into their profit and indeed may make their doing so completely unprofitable and non-viable. But we could improve Medicaid by creating more flexibility in the states to manage that beneficiary population and to expand coverage. And then we would expand provider competition and patient choice in Medicare. Those are 9 different reform proposals that we've been making since 2009 when Obamacare was first being debated. But it's clear our colleagues across the aisle were so concentrated on this huge takeover of our health care system, 1/6 of our economy, in a way that we now know is not going to work, that they weren't even listening. I hope they will now. Well, the reforms I've described enjoy broad support among Republicans on Capitol Hill. And my hope is, whether you were a critic of Obamacare like I was, or you were a skeptic and thought, well, maybe it'll work, but I'm not sure it will, or whether you were one of its biggest cheerleaders, now that we're seeing that these promises that were made by the President and others in order to sell this to the American people are not true, I'm hopeful that Democrats and Republicans can come together to try to fix our broken health care system. After witnessing Obamacare's disastrous rollout and its long trail of broken promises, I think most Americans would agree it's time for something different. I've read that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Obamacare is not going to get any better by continuing to do the same thing over and over again. I would hope that we would learn from our mistakes and we would work together to improve access and the price of health care to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.